I guess I can introduce who we've got here, and then I'll probably just turn it over to Javier. He and Miranda, I think, are doing the presentation.
Okay, great.
So let's see. I see Superintendent Botana is here, Mark Balfons, who's a member of the Finance Committee, Emily Figdor, who's a member of the Finance Committee, Adam Burke, who's a member of the board, Roberto Rodriguez, who's the board chair, Miranda Fasulo, who is our finance director, Tim Atkinson, who's a member of the board, and I think that's it.
Okay, great. So I think we'll turn then to Javier.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to begin our discussion of the proposed budget with the City Council. I've appreciated the conversations that our board leadership and staff have been able to have over the last couple of months with council leadership and staff as we prepared for this important annual review of our budget with the council. And this is the first of the two required joint finance committee reviews. I'm very grateful for the spirit of deliberation and trust that has helped us to shape this budget proposal that we're going to be talking about today, that recognizes the financial challenges that our community faces. Obviously, we listened in on the report from Brendan earlier, and there is a lot more detail to our knowledge today than there was when we pulled this budget together, but we've tried to recognize that we were going to be facing financial challenges, while at the same time it preserves the core of what our community expects from its schools and continues efforts to create a school system where a student's socioeconomic background is not a de facto proxy for their achievement levels. This is a very difficult and different budget discussion than any of our previous ones. The coronavirus pandemic defines our current reality in every way. On March 16th, the school district suspended in-person schooling and quickly shifted to remote learning. And this unprecedented and largely unplanned shift in educational design has brought into stark focus the underlying disparities that are at the basis of the opportunity gap. Over the past 2 months, our incredible Portland Public Schools staff have worked tirelessly to mitigate those challenges. We're distributing over 1,000 breakfasts and lunches daily at 11 sites across the district. We've distributed over 500 Wi-Fi hotspots to families, over 1,000 technology machines to our students, among other moves that we've been able to make. And I'm proud of the efforts of our dedicated staff and of our generous community. However, make no mistake, the existing gaps are only growing as a result of this shift to remote learning. While some students have stable home environments, food security, and support for their learning efforts through their homes, other students are burdened with multiple hardships. This year's budget recognizes that this particularly difficult moment brought with it an economic collapse for Portland, as we heard, as well as for Maine and for the entire world. The budget's context has changed markedly since I first proposed it on March 10th, in accordance with the city charter. The budget that's before you today is almost $2 million less than what I originally proposed on March 10th. In its current form, the proposed budget of $120.3 million represents a 2.5 expenditure and revenue increase over last year's budget and requires a school tax rate of 0.5 percentage point increase. For comparison purposes, the approved FY20 budget was $117.4 million, and that represented a 6.2% increase over the previous year and required a 4.9 school tax rate increase compared to that year. In our presentation today, we hope to provide details about this budget, including what is new and what is still undetermined as we balance the need to satisfy the requirements and timelines in our city's charter and state statute, while understanding that what next year's school year will actually look like is not known to any of us today. So we're going to begin our presentation. Miranda, are you pulling that up? So the next slide shows you our goals, which I've just outlined for you, making those key investments that will allow us to continue to close our achievement gap, and also attempting to build some flexibility that will allow us to respond to what is undoubtedly an evolving context. As I said, today we don't know with certainty what school is going to look like next year. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you quickly through the schedule. So this is the schedule as it currently stands from this point forward. So we are in our first joint finance committee meeting today. The school district's finance committee is meeting on Monday, and we'll also have a public hearing on that day to get public feedback on this proposed budget. There is a budget workshop and a public hearing scheduled for Tuesday at the regularly scheduled school board meeting, and that will also include a first read of the finance committee's adopted budget. And then that will be followed by another joint finance committee meeting. So this same body will meet again next week. And then the school board is scheduled to vote on the budget on May 26th at a special meeting that we've called just for the purpose of having a budget to present to you on June 1st. And then my understanding is that you have a public hearing and a first read scheduled on that day, and are scheduled to have a city council vote on June 15th, which will then give us the 30 days prior to the scheduled referendum, which is in July, the general election, or the primary election date. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miranda Fasulo, our Executive Director for Budget and Finance. She's going to walk you through some of the details, and then I will come back in a little bit to link the numbers to our process to date and ground you in what we're trying to accomplish as a school system as we talk about what is in the budget, what is yet to be determined. So with that, Miranda.
Thank you, Superintendent Botana. First of all, just hello, everyone. I think this is actually the first time that I've been a participant in a council event. So I just formally introduce myself, Miranda Fasulo. I just started as finance director this year, almost a year ago in June. So happy to be here. I'm just going to start off by walking us through a high-level summary of the financials of the budget that the superintendent is proposing. And a PDF of our budget book was also linked as part of the meeting materials, and you can find all the finer details laid out there. And of course, I'm happy to take questions as well. So just starting off with a few of the key figures, the superintendent hit on them a bit already, so I'll go through them quickly, but the proposed budget is $120.3 million. That represents a 2.5% increase over our current year budget in FY20. And that requires a school tax rate increase of 0.5%. And just to be clear, I've done that calculation over the school tax rate only. So taking that over the entire city tax rate would be about 0.25%. So comparing it to last year, and by last year, I mean the budget that you all reviewed last year. So to be clear, that's this year's FY20 budget. Last year's budget was $117.4 million. It represented an increase over FY19 of 6.2%. and that also represented a tax rate increase over FY19 of 4.9%. So staying at the summary level, but just with some more specific figures. As you can see here, we're of course proposing a balanced budget with both revenue and expenditures increasing by 2.5%. And as I mentioned earlier, that amounts to an increase of about $2.9 million over the current year, FY20. So this, you can see here on the slide that the property tax levy is up by about 1.6%, but about $1 million, just under that, is a result of the estimated increase in property tax valuation, with just the remaining difference of about $470,000 requiring that 0.5% school tax rate increase. So just moving into a little more detail on the revenue side, this is just to give you a general sense of our funding picture. So this is really in stark contrast to what Brendan presented earlier about the city budget. Our revenue budget is very, very distinctly from two specific sources. So 79%, as proposed currently, is represented by property taxes. And then 16% is state EPS funding. So that's specifically our essential programs and services state funding. We do get other state funding as well, but that's counted down in the last gray slice, which is all other sources, which only represent about 5% of our total revenue budget. So for some more specifics on the revenue side, I already talked a little bit about the property tax levy, and I will get into EPS a bit more in depth on the next slide. But just to give you a sense of what some of our other revenue sources are, our federal revenue is primarily comprised of the school lunch program. That's about $3 million. And Medicaid reimbursement, another $1 million, makes up our federal revenue sources. On the state side, outside of EPS funding, we get state agency client reimbursements, an adult ed subsidy as well. An adult ed subsidy is up about $100,000 in FY21. And I think I accidentally skipped over non-tax revenue. That includes tuition, both K-12 and adult ed, as well as paid meals for food services. And then down in fund balance, that's the total across all of our funds. So general fund, we budget about $500,000 in fund balance. For food, we're at $310,000 this year, and about $20,000 or so only in adult ed. And that $60,000 increase that you see there is just for a one-time equipment purchase in food services. Now, I do want to mention that $200,000, you can see on the slide that federal revenue is shown to have increased by about $300,000. $200,000 of that increase is actually simply a result of a change in accounting related to what's called our seed withholding, which is essentially the amount of Maine care eligible services that the district is actually responsible for covering. So I don't want to get into the details of the accounting, but just just for you to know that basically what is happening here is revenue is increasing by $200,000, but expenses are also increasing by $200,000. So basically what used to be accounted for as a revenue reduction is being accounted for as an expenditure increase. So I just want to clarify that that's not actually indicative of any particular increase to our federal revenue this year. So moving into the specifics of our state funding, and that our state funding comes out with a form each year called the ED 279. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. So as many of you know, we were fortunate this year, very fortunate, to actually see a substantial increase in our subsidy, which was in contrast to projections that we'd made earlier in the year, where we were expecting potential losses in the ballpark of $2 million or so. So I'll summarize the reasons for that, but before I do, I just want to give a quick reminder of the basics of how the state funding formula works. So basically the top 2/3 of the slide totaled in that first gray line that you're seeing is actually the state calculated district allocation. So what that is essentially the state's calculation of the resources required to provide an equitable education in a given district. So then the amount we actually receive in subsidy is that total allocation minus the amount that the state believes we as a city should be contributing to the cost of education. And that figure is the second gray line on the slide. So because of Portland's very high valuation, the figure for local contribution is also very high. And as it continues to go up, it acts as a downward driver of our subsidy. And as you can see, our local contribution did go up very significantly over FY20. We were just fortunate that our allocation went up by more than our local contribution did. So the key factors that improved our outlook for this year, number one was the governor's supplemental budget, which increased the state share of the cost of education and reduced the mill rate by 10 cents when it otherwise would have actually increased. And every 10 cents, just 10 cents on the mill rate up or down, changes our funding by about 900,000, whether it's plus or minus. So that impact is very substantial. Number two was related to changes made to our reporting at the state level of teacher years of experience that actually affect our state subsidy. So after a comprehensive review this year, it was determined that we'd been underreporting teacher years of experience in the past, and correcting for that resulted in a bump in funding for this year of approximately 1.3 million. So those are the key drivers of our change in expectation. And with everything all told, our subsidy increased by just over $1 million for FY21. So moving on to the expenditure side of the house, this is just yet another graphic to show also what Brendan mentioned and was discussed earlier, that our costs are very much salary and benefits driven. So 79%, exactly the same amount that just so happens to be funded by property taxes, is comprised of salary and benefits costs for us. Another 8% is contracted services, 7% debt service, and 7% supplies and other miscellaneous costs. So getting into a little bit more of the details on the expense side, our salaries and benefits expenses are up by 2.1 million or 2.2%, driven largely by bargained COLAs and step increases. I'd like to make a couple notes as well on this. The first thing is that this budget reflects a shift of $1.3 million in salary and benefits costs for custodial staff off of the local budget in anticipation of being able to put those costs on federal funding that we're slated to receive from the CARES Act. And we're still waiting for our final CARES allocation amounts, but we expect to receive somewhere between 1.45 and 1.75 million. And we'll also have to receive approval to use the funds in this way, but we do expect that this will be an allowable cost. CARES funding will be managed as a federal grant, and therefore those costs have been moved off and are not reflected in front of you on this slide or in this budget, either on the cost side or on the revenue side. So I just want to make sure that's clear. Additionally, we were very fortunate this year to see a 0% increase in our health and dental rates. The 3% increase that you do see in the benefits line on this slide is because of the way some of our contracts are bargained, including our teachers' contract, where we're required to increase our employer contributions in order to reduce employee contributions. Additionally, we're a bit under budget in health this year, so some of this is truing up that budget. So in terms of FTEs, you'll see in the budget book in a lot of detail. If you're interested, the net increase in FTE over FY20 budgeted FTEs is 4.67, but I do want to be completely transparent that that does include a minus 20 custodial FTEs shifted off of local funding to the CARES Act funding. So including those FTEs, functionally, we're really looking at an increase of about 25 FTEs over FY20, and of those, about 17 were additions that were made during the current fiscal year. So on the non-salary side, we're seeing an increase of about 900,000 with utilities, and in that line is primarily natural gas and electricity, seeing the biggest percent increase, up by 13%. I just want to point out that while that figure is up 13% over FY20, it's actually only 3% over FY19 actual, so that's why we're seeing such a large adjustment for FY21. So just to go in a little more detail on some of the drivers of the non-salary expenses, debt service is actually down slightly due to the way the LISEF bond issuance was structured. But it will be back up by at least 700,000 just for LISEF alone next year when we're slated to make our first principal payment. Utilities I already mentioned. There are some non-salary items for pre-K that needed to be built in this year, as we learned from last year's expansion and the associated costs there. Metro fares have gone up, as have our rates for crossing guards, and of course this assumes that we're back in school in the fall. Recycling costs are up everywhere. Our property and liability insurance rates are up fairly substantially. We have the seat adjustment that I mentioned before, up 200 in revenue, also up 200 on the expense side, and that's really just a wash. There's no tax rate impact there. And finally, we have about 100,000 in non-salary costs as a result of new curriculum investments that we have proposed in this budget. So finally, I just want to take a quick look at the tax rate impact. As I mentioned before, the estimated increase in valuation alone increases the levy by about $1 million. And then thereafter, incrementally, each percentage increase to the school tax rate yields approximately $950,000 in revenue. So that 0.5% increase that we're putting forth represents about $475,000 in revenue. And that 6-cent increase that we're proposing represents about $15 a year to a taxpayer who owns a property valued at $250,000. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back to the superintendent to talk a bit more about the programmatic and conceptual side of what's included in his proposed budget.
Can you go ahead to the next slide, please? Thank you, Miranda. So I want to just walk you through a little bit of the evolution of the budget. And obviously, this is a work in progress. As I said in my introductory statement, the context has changed significantly since this budget was first presented in March, and the numbers have changed significantly as a result of that. So my original budget proposal on March 10th was for $122.3 million. It included a number of significant changes, some reductions, and some increases that were substantial programmatic changes. On March 12th, which was just 2 days after the budget presentation, we recognized that the coronavirus pandemic was around the bend. And as I mentioned, there were some significant programmatic changes that were in that budget proposal. And one of them in particular was the reconfiguration of our elementary schools. And in the memo that we provided along with our budget book, there's details around some of what was intended with that elementary reconfiguration. But it was obviously a very significant change in terms of the way that our schools are structured. And given the considerable amount of bandwidth that would have gone into being able to execute on that change in the context that we saw around the bend, I withdrew that reconfiguration proposal, and with it, withdrew a number of investments that were associated with the savings that we would have been able to achieve with that reconfiguration. So along with eliminating that reconfiguration, we also eliminated investments in transportation for our pre-K students, some supports for our English language learners, special education caseloads, adult education staffing, our district website, and some of our curriculum investments that we were proposing. Along with that, because some of the reconfiguration impact was changing the demographics in our schools, we had a reduction in federal funding for our high poverty elementary schools in the neighborhood of $650,000, much of which was to be offset with the savings from the elementary reconfiguration and the different demographics at our schools. And so that reduction is now in our budget. So the expectation, well, it isn't anymore, but it was in the budget that I presented on March 26th. So that was the net effect of having eliminated the elementary reconfiguration. A week ago, after multiple meetings with the council's leadership, with the board's leadership, and with the finance committee, I presented a revised budget to the council. I'm sorry, to the finance committee that was for $119.9 million. So that was in effect getting us a 0% tax increase request. Then after discussion with the finance committee, we made some changes, and thus the budget that you have in front of you. Next slide, Miranda. So obviously the context in which those changes happened were, many of them are grounded, tied to the COVID-19 impact. So everything from the delaying of our elementary reconfiguration to having a completely different educational context in the way that we're teaching our students, and the budget context, which we heard earlier from Brendan, is significantly different than what it was at that time. And, you know, obviously with that, significant unknowns that are playing out as we speak in what we are looking at for next year. We also, in the course of this past couple of months, received, as Miranda mentioned, news that we would get CARES funding. That's the federal funding for COVID relief. And we expect that we will get somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.7 million. We don't know yet what it's actually going to be. We've heard anything from between 1.5 to 2 million. And so, you know, this is what we're thinking it will ultimately be. And as Miranda also mentioned, we received good news on our health insurance rates with no increase for this year. And also because time has passed, we have a better picture of what our end of year budget looks like. So we've had some adjustments in our revenue from the state, which are factored in to our numbers. Debt service, some things not coming on that were scheduled to come on, some non-salary adjustments that have been made, and you know, things along those lines. So that's all now reflected in our budget, and so that's part of that evolving context. So again, just to remind you, what we're trying to achieve with the budget is to make some key investments that are going to continue to allow us to move the work of the school district forward. The students that are going to be in front of us next year are, you know, the future taxpayers of this community, and their needs are only increasing as a result of the pandemic. And so, you know, what I want to do next is talk a little bit about some of the reductions, programmatic changes that are reflected in the budget, as well as the things that we are investing in. So among the reductions, there are a number that you have probably already heard from constituents about. One in particular is the elimination of our 4th and 5th grade Spanish instruction. That is a program that is extremely valuable to many students, and it's a really nice thing to have. But when we have significant needs on the equity side in the district, and we need to find the resources to support it, we made the hard decision to say that we would eliminate that 4th and 5th grade Spanish program starting next year. We also have made adjustments in our high school staffing based on enrollment, and so that's yielded some reductions at the high school level. We made some changes in central office and operations staffing, which includes a custodian, and then some changes to our contingency funds, some contracts that are year-to-year contracts, as well as assuming some reductions in our cost of living adjustments for employees that are not represented, and for those contracts that are not currently negotiated, so not the ones that we're already locked into, which, as you, Councilor Mavadonis asked City Manager Jennings about that in the previous section about the need to negotiate that. So those are not reduced. The contracts that are currently negotiated have not been reduced, the cost of living adjustments, but we are in conversations with our unions about those. We made a 3% reduction in our supplies, and we are proposing a 6% reduction in our athletics and co-curricular. What was in the budget back a week ago was $40,000 in reductions, and then in order to be able to achieve some of the investments that I'm going to talk about next, we had to execute and actually reflect in the budget a additional reduction of $100,000 in co-curriculars. So the investments that are proposed and are in our budget, one is the continued expansion of our pre-kindergarten. So that is, last year we agreed to a 5-year plan that would get us to what we consider to be full capacity for our pre-kindergarten in the city. And so that expansion, the 2 additional classroom teachers and ed techs in expansion sites, is in our current budget. And I think it's important to also indicate, and Miranda touched on this when she went through the ED 279, the state funding, that those 2 positions bring with them state revenue that we would lose if we did not have those positions. So we would see a reduction that is equivalent to that increase that is in there. We have $125,000 in the budget to sustain and deepen some of our core instruction work. That's particularly focused on our adoption of a phonics literacy curriculum and the full implementation of what has been a pilot for the past year in elementary mathematics. So that's the bulk of the cost associated with this. We have a very real need to have a continuum of services for our students with autism in the high school. We have a strong elementary and middle school program, and those students have been moving up, and we have been able to serve them this year through our Breathe program, which you may recall from last year is focused on students with significant behavioral and mental health issues. But those students that were in the middle school in Breathe are now coming to the high school, and we need to be able to create the equivalent to what we have at the middle school for those students, and that's a significant increase. In response to the expected need for more nursing staffing, this is new from the budget that I originally submitted. We are adding 0.8 nurse services to be able to get to a level of nursing that our nursing coordinator believes is necessary with the work that we will be facing in the year ahead. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when we withdrew the elementary reconfiguration, we knew that there would be a significant number of cuts to our high poverty schools because of reductions in our title funding. When we brought that to the Finance Committee last week, and we started to discuss what you will see next, the kind of investments that we foresee needing to put in place to mitigate some of those achievement gaps, the Finance Committee urged us to include, to not make those reductions at the high poverty elementary schools. And the way that we do that is by shifting something else that would have been paid out of title funding into our general fund. And so that is our shift of our math coaches that are currently funded out of title funding and into the general fund budget. And so those are the total investments that we have in the budget today. I want to take a minute to also talk about the fact that we are cognizant of the fact that there are unexpected needs that we haven't been fully able to articulate at this point, that range from the very tangible things like protective equipment for our staff, and to things that are we foresee needing, like extended learning opportunities, extended day, extended year for students who have gaps that have just gotten worse as a result of being in remote learning. But in addition to that, things like our continued expenditures for technology for families and students who don't have it, particularly as we move into next year. If we are in remote learning settings, that's something that we are figuring that we will need to cover. Additional support for engaging with our families through this crisis. It's become evident the critical role that our parent and community specialists in particular play in being able to connect with our most vulnerable families. And so we would foresee that those needs would get even larger as we move forward, as well as all of the related HR expenses, things like unemployment, leave coverages, and things along those lines. So we are intending to reserve, depending on how much money we get in the CARES, how much we ultimately get in the CARES grant, somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 to $500,000 that would be a contingency fund to support some of these needs. So then what's not in the budget today, but things that we foresee having to figure out how to fund as we move into next year. And these are particularly if we move into next year with a sort of in-person school. So if we're able to return to near normal circumstances, some of the things that we would need, and these are prioritized in the order in which we would foresee trying to put those in place. Things like our secondary program for students with limited and interrupted formal education. One of the realities of our current situation is that those students who are newest to the country, who have the least knowledge of our school system, and are most reliant on our staff are the ones that have suffered the most through this process. And so for us to have the type of programming to support the needs of those students is, clearly an important part of that, as well as meeting the needs of our students who are both special education eligible and students who are English language learners at the same time. So that's our dually identified students. Support for staffing in our English language learner programs to be able to collaborate with our regular classroom teachers to meet the needs of our English language learners. Support for increase in our caseload, support for special education, as well as the remainder of our curriculum scale up, which we had to pare back when we did not do the elementary configuration, and also our website, which one of the things that has become very evident to us is that our website as it currently exists is not capable of meeting the needs that we have to communicate with our public. And so that would be another thing that, as we move into the year, we foresee needing to put in place. And so these, as I mentioned, are not currently in the budget. So one of the things that we are facing is as the school year opens, as we get closer to the start of the school year and we understand what the needs are going to be, some things that we would potentially fund out of what is in our current budget, we would not put in place, and instead could reallocate some of the resources to support this, as well as the labor concessions and things along those lines that we've been working to achieve that would allow us to support these investments. So obviously there are huge risks that are associated with what we're proposing to do. So, first and foremost, we have, just as we look at our multi-year budget and we look at what is projected for FY22, the escalation of current salaries and benefits, the debt service that's coming due, as well as the fact that we have moved a significant number of positions for this interim period into our CARES funding. That will all come due. And so those are, very significant risks that we are looking at down the road. Miranda touched on this, and, we have said this for a number of years now, that we expect that our state contributions will continue to dwindle as long as the formula is based largely on valuation. The Portland City valuation is something that will undoubtedly come back to us in less state revenue down the road. And, again, our projection, which was for about $2.5 to $3 million of reduced state revenue, that is not factoring in shortfalls in state revenue that are likely to occur. And it actually assumed an increase in the percentage of the cost of education that is picked up by the state, which is something that Governor Mills had committed to doing and had followed through both last year and this year, but that seems less likely moving forward. And then obviously the fact that the CARES grant is fully earmarked or largely earmarked this year between the custodial salaries and that contingency fund that we discussed. And so what are we looking at as mitigation? Obviously one is to look to retain as much flexibility as we possibly can to reduce expenses in this fiscal year in FY21. The extent to which we do that will allow us to preserve more of the CARES funding to be able to carry over into the following year should some of those state revenue decreases actually come to fruition. So I think that's one of the major mitigations that we need to put in place. And at the same time, we're balancing that with the need to make those investments that I just discussed are not currently in the budget. And then we know that we need to make some key structural changes, and the elementary reconfiguration was just that. And so we tabled that. We did not shelve it. So it is something that we are committed to taking back up and looking to advance that in the following year. And at the same time, we have been working for a year now on a different funding model for both, well, primarily for our high school. And you saw some of that play out in the staffing reductions that I talked about earlier, but we are looking to have a more of a staffing model that we don't currently have in place to be able to allocate staff to the high school, as well as looking at doing something along those lines with our middle schools, where we're able to preserve the value of the middle school model as it currently exists with teaming, but at the same time costs less than what it currently costs, which is about 20%, 15 to 20% over what it costs to provide, if we were to provide a junior high school level of staffing. So that's where we are. And so we will, obviously, I don't know if any of our board members want to add anything to that, or if not, I guess we will open it up to Chair Mavadonis to call on people that have questions.
Do you have any, Roberto or Anna, or any of your school board members?
I'll just briefly jump in. So we met on Thursday as a finance committee, and it was kind of the first look that we had at this new iteration of the budget, because obviously COVID-19 changed everything from the last budget that we were looking at. And I think as we were deliberating at and this was in the presentation, the big thing that felt like a real loss to us would have been that $650,000 in Title I funding. Those are positions that we have today that go to our schools with the highest poverty rates. So they affect our poorest students. And the sentiment of the finance committee was wanting to keep that in the budget. So that's, I think, the major difference between what was presented in the superintendent's budget to us and what the finance committee kind of came to by the end of the meeting.
Thanks, Anna. We'll see if counselors have questions and thoughts. I do want to say, and Javier touched on it, and I want to commend him and Anna and Roberto and Miranda. We have had a number of conversations. Well, it was before COVID because we actually started in person. And I really appreciate the honesty and the work that has gone on around those conversations. We were talking a lot about revaluation when we first started and the impacts of that. And come mid-March, that changed dramatically in our conversations. But it's really, these have been informal conversations, but it's really been a pleasure to work with you guys. And I thank you for that. And I think I know my colleagues feel the same way. Let's see, I have some hands up, and let me just get over there. So it looks like I have Councillor Thibodeau up first and then Councillor Chong. Spencer?
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor. Mr. Superintendent, good to see you. I think is it Miranda?
Yes.
Miranda said something about the increase of positions. I think it said increase of, was it 25 or was it 17? I was trying to understand what you were saying there. So would you mind just talking about this real quick?
Yeah, sure. So the actual net increase in the local budget for FY21 as proposed, and as you'll see outlined in the budget book, is 4.67. That, however, includes a negative 20 positions shifted off to the CARES grant. So if you were to add those back, because really fundamentally those are still functionally our positions, it would be approximately an add of 25. That add is over what was budgeted, the FTEs that were budgeted for FY20. During the course of FY20, we added 17 positions. So only 8 then are the net proposal for actually in the FY21 budget. Does that clarify things?
That is not what I had written down, but that is so much more helpful.
And that's my fault. But it is, I'm not sure exactly what page, but there are 2 or 3 pages dedicated specifically to the FTEs and delineate literally every single position that has changed since our FY20 budget. So if you want to look at the specific details, they're all right there in the budget book for you.
And then a question for Javier. Mr. Superintendent, you said, I think it was is it fiscal year 2022, you were looking at, if we were to pass the budget you proposed, an increase up to 126.5 million is what you thought. And I just wanted to understand, is that large increase based on partially on the fact that there are certain grants that will go away and this will shift back onto, some of those positions will shift back onto your I guess your payroll. I don't know if that's the right terminology, but can you speak to that?
That's part of it, and then just standard escalations of negotiated contracts and assumptions in increases in utilities and things along those lines, as well as the debt service that would be coming onto our budget at that time.
And then
that's our multi-year budget projection for next year.
I guess, okay, that's really helpful. I think maybe between now and the next meeting, I'd want to think about that a little bit more. Maybe I'll ask a few more questions because there's some other hands up. But I think what I'm most concerned about is kind of the difference that I just heard between the presentation we had and then this one, where we just talked about on the city side, worst case scenario, negative 200 employees, and that is the worst case scenario. So I want to be very clear about that. And we've made, I think you can agree, we've made a number of investments over the last 5 years, and from funding. And I think my concern really is that when we made those investments, my position was always, yes, we're going to make these investments, but these are really good times. What I'm really concerned about is we're now talking about additional investments, some of which I certainly agree with, and your presentation I think is great. But I'm really concerned about the budget impact that we're talking about, right? And then the sustainability for the next year. If we know that fiscal year 2021 is going to be challenging, fiscal year 2022 could be even worse, right? And so I'm really concerned. I think what my ask between now and the next meeting, going to the Doosan rule, really is for kind of a similar outline of understanding what reductions look like, because I think that's absolutely necessary as part of our due diligence. And I think Brendan O'Connell had a really good way of framing that, but he's asking department heads to cut or reduce by 10 to 20% in the first 2 months of fiscal year 2021. And we're talking about increases on the school side. So I just want to understand what all of those look like. And I just appreciate, I know this is challenging, and this is going to be a really challenging time for all of us, but I just appreciate your leadership and what you've put forward. And the overview is really helpful. And Miranda, great to see you as well. And I'll yield back.
Thank you, Councillor. We now have Councillor Chong.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind the public and also the school committee that this council is probably the most school committee friendly council that I've ever seen, probably anywhere in the entire country, where you have 6 out of 9 councilors who were former school board members, and 4 were former school chair members, and 2 are champions on immigrant, refugee, and ESL issues, where I was personally involved in changing how ESL was delivered in the Portland school system through the NAACP. So you have a very education-friendly, very immigrant and poverty-focused city council that really cares about kids. That said, when I was on the school committee, and this was before the recession, we had budget cuts where we had to have reduction in staff every year that I was on the school committee. And you know, Kate Snyder and Justin and other people had it much worse because they went through the Great Recession. And I'm trying to understand that if the school committee is a department, it's the largest department within the city government, and there are other department heads, and we're all getting together, and all the other department heads know that they have to see a reduction because we are seeing probably the worst municipal budget scenario we've ever seen in our city's history. I'm trying to understand how we can advocate for a 2.5% increase and have 25 more FTEs where we have to carry 20 when the CARES Act goes away next year, and see a reduction in revenue and see more other costs added on top of that. I don't see how that model is sustainable, and I'm trying to understand the logic behind that when you have these kind of real world situations. And so, you know, the thing for me that I'm trying to wrap my head around is, you know, you've got, you know, I love the fact that we give out 1,000 breakfasts a day and we give out personal computers, but police officers and firefighters and people who work at the homeless shelters put their lives in danger every day. Their PPE costs and their custodial costs all went up just like everybody else's. And they're all going through different types of protocols. They're looking at a reduction of 10%. And those services are life and death. And they're, you know, all these different departments are equally important. And so when we see one side with a 10% reduction, but then another side seeing a 2.5% increase, I'm just trying to follow the logic when we're going through the worst financial situation in our city's history. That's one. And two, what I'd like to see is different scenarios, because we don't know what school's going to look like in the fall. I'd love to see what are the savings we've had from having distance learning. I understand that teachers are working overtime. My wife is a social worker. I understand all that stuff. But I'd like to see like the breakdown in the physical savings we've had because we've had virtual classrooms. You know, I just want numbers. I'd like to see real numbers. You can shake your head. I want to see real numbers. And I'd like to see different scenarios going forward. But I really would like, like, I would really like to understand, given the severity of where we are, we're seeing potentially 20% unemployment, in the state of Maine, 125,000 people apply for unemployment. Can you help me understand why we would advocate for a 2.5% increase and other kind of hidden costs where we're going to be paying for other staff when the CARES Acts go away? So I'm just trying to understand that.
Let me try to address that. First of all, I understand and know that we are in a precarious situation. We had not heard anything about the city 10% cuts until just before this meeting, and our budget process has been ongoing for months. We also, so our conversations to date have not included those revenue projections that we saw today, right? So we're building the budget based on the assumptions that we were working with. And so we worked hard to get our budget down to that 2.5 increase, which does not require, or now requires a 0.5% increase in the tax rate. So we are working from the assumptions that we had at the time that we pulled this budget together. We have, and actually in our PowerPoint, and we can pull them up if you want, we can show you what our additional costs have been as a result of COVID, as well as what the potential reductions, savings have been also to go with that. I can pull up the slides or we can give them to you, but overall we have had an additional $1 million in costs and about $500,000 in savings. So a net of an additional $500,000 in costs for this year. So there is no savings as a result of what we've done. It's actually cost more money to do what we've done.
Ryan said that you're getting between 1.4 and 1.75 million dollars in COVID reimbursement around custodial costs. So then you will actually would be down. You would be up by $900,000 to
that's next year's
1.3. So yeah. So
that's next year's budget. You asked the question about this year's budget, and so at this point, we've actually incurred $1 million in costs and have been able to make $500,000 in reductions. I will say that one of the reasons that that is the way that it is that unlike the city, which has had the ability to do furloughs and things along those lines, the executive order from the governor was to preserve all current staffing at full funding through the end of this fiscal year. So some of those, so we've had bus drivers that are not driving kids. Now, many of them are doing other things. They're helping with food distribution and things along those lines. But, we've paid them as if they were working every day. And that was, as a result of the executive order from the governor. So we have not been able to realize some of the savings that, for example, the city talked about in their presentation. But again, just to be clear, we're working from the assumptions that we had coming into today, which were obviously different from the ones that you're looking at. I think the other thing that you have to take into consideration is that we have some statutory deadlines for getting our budget done, right? We're not in a position where we can wait until September to present a budget. And so, we're thinking of, this is our current budget. This is what it would cost to run this budget, given the assumption that we will have students in school next year. And then try to have the flexibility to make adjustments as we enter that year if our realities are different from what we are currently budgeted for. So when I talked in one of the slides about that flexibility, I was actually talking about the fact that, if we aren't transporting kids next year, we won't need to have our full transportation department. If we're not serving meals, if we're not, if we don't have 1,000 kids walking through our building, then we won't need the same level of custodial staffing that we currently have. So we changes next year that we don't have in this current year, but we're in a place where we need to bring a budget. We have statutory deadlines. We need to have 30 days between the time that the council approves the budget and it goes to referendum. And some of those things are just, they're written into state law and into the city's charter.
Hey, do you have some more questions? And I will say, and Javier, thanks for replying. We tend to ask for some memos and things when we ask for data or things. So we know we're meeting in another week, and it's not a long time, but feel free to provide information or responses in memo form as well. I have Councilor Ray next.
Thank you very much, Chair Mavadonis. So actually, the first thing I want to touch on is the last thing that Javier was talking about. And I was wondering, I know that the governor did issue a ruling that allows the municipalities, and I thought schools as well, to continue with their current year budget. So I was just wondering how that could potentially impact you if, I don't know what you would do, but if you were to present the budget later and then go to referendum in November, it's not ideal. Obviously, you want to have this figured out so you know who you're contracting for teachers and you're not leaving people in the lurch. But I just didn't know if there was any extra flexibility there in this situation. So that's my first question.
So the impact of that would be another $3 million reduction from our current budget. So in order to achieve that, we would have to make very significant layoffs across the board. And to be able to actually realize that, we would have to make those decisions now because of the notice provisions in contracts and in state law. So we would have, by July 1st, we would have to be notifying people just to be able to realize those reductions. So that's, that was one of the things that we considered in, moving forward, and, decided that we would actually try to meet the requirements that are currently in place so that we don't start the school year decimated with, $3 million in reductions, then to find out that, revenues are, otherwise and so on. So I think that's the main reason behind it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I'm always, some would say foolhardy. I say optimistic, always hoping that, if you wait a little bit, maybe something's going to happen that's going to bring more money or make the situation a little more tenable. But obviously tonight's presentation from Brendan has kind of driven home how dire the situation is in this particular moment. So that places everyone in a really difficult place. I think I wanted to ask, with the CARES allocations, do you have an idea when you will know definitively what you're getting? Is that something that should happen in the next couple of weeks, or is that further off?
So a week ago, we would have said we knew for sure and that we were going to have that information today, and it's becoming less clear that that's the case. There's a dispute with the U.S. Department of Education over the way that the funding is distributed. So I think that may wind up taking a long time to sort through. Our delegation, as well as the national advocacy organizations for schools, are very actively lobbying the Department of Education to change that ruling. If that ruling doesn't change, the 1.7 becomes 1.5. So I think that that's that issue. It's the way that the money gets distributed and the share that goes to non-public schools.
Okay. Oh, okay. Let's see what else I had. The elementary reconfiguration, I understand why you pulled back on that. Is that something you see having the potential to bring forward again in order to reduce for this coming year, or do you think it would be further out that you'd be looking at that?
I mean, I think I definitely brought it forward with, conviction that it was the right thing to do and that it was doable. It was not universally loved by everyone, including members of the school board. So I do know that in my withdrawal of that I made it clear that I would continue to move that work forward into the next year. And so our process to engage families, to explain what we're trying to do, why we're trying to do it, give people assurances that that we would be able to execute on it and make it a great experience for students, which I believe it will be, is the work that lies ahead for us. I think that one of the things that, you always look for the silver linings. I think one of the silver linings of the current situation is that I think a recognition that it's the what happens in classrooms, what are those relationships with teachers is, more important than, whether your school is a block away or a mile away. I think that is, evident to all of our families every day, and certainly to me.
Yeah, I think that this situation, as unfortunate as it is, has presented some learning opportunities for all of us like that. And I was struck. Obviously, you have been aware of the opportunity gap for a while, but I was struck in reading through your documents how remote learning has made that opportunity gap even more apparent. Because as people are learning at home, and you said this at the beginning of your presentation, some people have very supportive home environments with a lot of resources, and some people do not. And so the gap gets bigger. And I think we see that across the community too. Obviously, during this pandemic, it's become very obvious who has a safety net and who doesn't in the larger community, regardless of age or student or professional or whatever you're doing. So there have been some opportunities to really highlight during this time some of the serious needs that we have as a community, as a nation. And I don't envy the struggle that you face in making the choices you need to make. I do think that in looking at the budgets that were presented over time, I would be more comfortable with the budget that was proposed by the superintendent originally before it hit the finance committee. That still includes an increase in spending, but it's a zero on the tax levy. I might be more comfortable with that. I know on the city side, we are probably looking negative. We're probably looking at negative. It's really hard to be thinking about cutting positions, cutting services. And I know it's hard to think about that in schools as well. So I think I'm gonna leave my questions there for this evening, and thank you very much. I know that there's been a lot of hard work to come before this committee tonight for this joint meeting with a 0.5% increase. That's obviously not typical. 0% less typical. These are not easy times. So I appreciate the work that you are doing and that the school board is doing to try to get to a level that is going to allow us to continue to educate, but also be a little more sustainable for the city. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Mayor Snyder's up next. You're muted.
Sorry.
Hi.
So I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here tonight, and repeat what Councilor Mavedona said, that over the last, at least my involvement over the last couple of months with the superintendent, finance chair, and chair of the school board has been really productive. along with Nick and the city manager and me, being able to talk through and share information as we get it with one another. And it's all changing so rapidly. So thank you all for that. I know that this is terribly difficult. As I sit here as a former school board person, my first thought goes to kids, and I feel like I'm sorry to go on, but I just want to at least let folks on this call know that the word that I'm getting from families about how the school district has pivoted since the middle of March has been so extraordinarily positive. And I want to thank the teachers and the principals and staff and leadership for that. So. Because every time we talk about school budgets, we're talking about kids and that incredibly important investment. We're also talking about families who choose to stay in Portland and send their kids to school. And I think that's an incredibly important investment as well. So I don't want anybody to think that I'm not thinking through that lens, and the attention paid to the opportunity gap over the last several years in Portland, I think, has been very welcome and appreciated. As Councilor Ray indicated, what we're seeing on the city side with I'm looking at the term opportunity gap, and I'm seeing families who are struggling to pay rent, and I'm seeing business owners who are struggling to even contemplate how they'll stay alive as the economy slowly reopens. And so I think that we're all, as elected officials in the city of Portland, facing this incredible challenge to figure out how we manage largely property taxes in response to people losing their incomes and struggling, ever mindful of the fact that our taxes pay for important services, including schools. So anyway, that's my preamble. I'm going to have a specific question and then maybe a suggestion. So I got to go back to these. Sorry, because I know you answered the question, Miranda, so nicely for Spencer, for Councilor Thibodeau. But the employee situation and moving some folks over to the CARES Act, and I don't need to. I can go to that page and I can figure out the FTE movement here and there and what's new. But my concern is for FY22. And I feel like anytime we take a category of employees and we move them into a funding realm that's likely to go away or decrease is a concern. I know it is of yours as well. So I guess I just want to raise that and recognize that in FY21, if let's say 25 employees are being paid for with federal money, the likelihood is I assume they're going to shift back into the local budget in FY22, 23. And one thing I certainly learned between 2010 and 2011 was that nothing happens in a year. So I want to maybe put that out there, and I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that at this moment, but it's a concern that I've got. And I'll add in there the $700,000 in debt service that I think was intentionally lifted from the books for FY21. As kind of a relief mechanism, and if I'm wrong there, please jump in. But I do worry about that not being in the FY21 budget and being pushed into 22. So as you can tell, my concern is FY22 when I talk about those things.
I'm gonna start on that, and then Miranda, maybe you can help. I think we made a conscious decision to use the CARES Act money to support something that we know would be an allowable expense, because there are limits to what will be allowable under CARES. And so I think that was the thinking associated with that. Otherwise, up until last week, we didn't have those positions, under the CARES Act. So we could, again, in sort of the spirit of flexibility that that I talked about earlier in terms of how we're thinking about this budget, we could allocate that money in a different direction to support the investments in high poverty schools and things along those lines. But ultimately, it's still, in our context, it's going to be paying for positions, since 80% of our budget is, position based. So very few things that would be, maybe we could pay for, some of the technology purchases and things along those lines, but there's few things that we would pay for under the CARES Act that would not involve staff positions. So I think that's the reality of using that money. So whether it's those 20 custodial positions, there were a number of factors that went into making that decision. They include the lower rate of retirement funding that would need to go with those positions, as opposed to if we put teacher positions or something along those lines, we could have fewer in there that would actually impact the EFT. So I think that's one. I don't think that we artificially removed anything from CIP. I think that it has more to do with borrowing schedules. So I don't know, Miranda, if you want to take that on, or if that's something that maybe Brendan, if he's still on the call, can also help with that. But
I can answer that. So, initially, and as of the last budget presented to the Finance Committee, we had that debt service still in the budget, reconstituted for 1 year only for a contingency fund, recognizing that next year it's going to have to come back on the budget. So for a variety of reasons, we made a shift to instead save those funds on CARES rather than budget more custodial costs on CARES. So we actually had 1.7 million or so custodial positions initially budgeted on CARES, in part because of the factors that Javier mentioned. So when we charge teachers or ed techs on federal money, we pay 22% retirement instead of 4% on local. That's not true for custodians. So yes, it would conceptually feel like it makes more sense to potentially put some of those investments that Javier was talking about, or even the title preservation costs on the CARES funds. It doesn't make sense mechanically, and it's just not a prudent or efficient use of those particular funds. That said, I completely agree with you. I am very concerned about FY22. We did not know initially that these CARES funds could potentially roll into FY22 and be utilized over the course of 2 years. We are hopeful that we can preserve as much as possible in the event that we are in remote learning next year. If we were to pursue furloughs and we were able to preserve a good chunk of that, we could potentially have those custodians for 2 years, stave off the really, really painful cuts until we understand how we're going to come out of all of this. And I think just to the kind of general point, I know there's concern about the $6 million figure on that slide in terms of the FY22 budget. That is maintenance of effort, just to show if we went along as, happy days, we would potentially have a $6 million increase next year. That's why we put those mitigation plans up in front of you. The middle school model, reconfiguration, high school staffing, those are big structural potential changes. That's how we're going to address that. Because we do see this as a very concerning challenge for FY22, but we have this ability to try and stave it off till we know more and till we can actually put really strong concerted plans in place to make those structural changes next year. We're a little more prepared. I'm happy to.
So Miranda, forgive me if I missed something, but the debt service number that you mentioned earlier, and I assume in FY22 there will be additional elementary debt service coming onto the books. And again, I'm not looking for big explanation here. I want to know if I'm correct in thinking that the debt service that we'll see in FY22 will be meaningfully more than what we would see in the proposed FY21 budget.
That is correct.
Okay. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there. And I'll wrap up simply by saying, because I know other people have their hands up and it's getting late, but I think that given the circumstances and the numbers that we're seeing, it might be helpful next week when we meet jointly to talk about a 0% increase on the tax as a possibility, as well as a 0% increase on the budget year over year.
You all set, Kate?
Yep.
I have Councillor Costa up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So a couple of things, and I'll try to be relatively quick. First of all, just obviously thank you guys for all the tremendous work that's gone into this. You know, this isn't even close to my first rodeo anymore, so I appreciate what has to happen to bring these budgets into reality. A couple of points that I just wanted to pick up on. In general, I would share the concerns that I think some of my colleagues are voicing about the use of the CARES Act funding and the implications that that can have for some of the out years and things like that. However, I think in this environment, that's actually the least of my concern right now, because I think we're going to kind of have, to my mind, we're going to have to deal with that one way or another. And if the worst case scenario is that we buy ourselves a year and we have to come back and have that conversation as part of the next fiscal year's budget development, I can live with that, which I'm shocked that I'm hearing myself say, but given the magnitude of everything else, I can kind of get my head around that. I also, in particular, just want to say that I certainly understand what you guys are doing with the positions, and I think a few others will remember it's almost exactly what we did with the Recovery Act funds last time that this happened. In fact, the conversation is almost a perfect parallel. It started out as a one-year thing and then gained additional flexibility, and we were able to spread that out over multiple fiscal years, which helped, lessen the budgetary swings. And we did end up putting the exact same positions into that funding at the time as well, for exactly the same reasons that were just being explained. So I'm relatively comfortable, again, in our current sort of crisis context, I'm relatively comfortable with that. I just wanted to, say, I think it's just important to kind of review the timeline a little bit, because I certainly want to voice my appreciation for the superintendent and the extremely awkward position that you're in, because basically you presented a budget to immediately have it kind of wiped out by the arrival of the pandemic, having to shut down schools, everything from that point on. At the same time, I think it just for members of the public to understand as well, part of this is that you have to do it to meet certain requirements in the charter, and then we have to move in a specific time frame to be able to get ultimately the school budget out to referendum on the timeline that was anticipated, which was a June referendum at the time. It also wasn't until after your initial budget presentation that the elections were postponed, which now gives us some additional time to work through all of these things. So I do just want to acknowledge that and understand how difficult it is that we're sort of starting from a baseline that was established without a lot of good knowledge here. So in terms of going forward, I'll just, put out a couple of high-level thoughts. I think for all of us on the council side, we understand where you're coming from, but as the mayor just suggested too, I think we're going to have to look at this, and I would be I want to be clear that I think for our analytical purposes in our discussion, we've got to sort of include the CARES Act funding in the budget discussion that we're having. I think people are going to want to see a net zero positions. You know, we're going to want to know what that kind of looks like. And, you know, we just obviously had the presentation on our side of things. You know, and I forget how it was brought up earlier, but, you know, on the city side of things, a loss of 200 positions is like the good scenario. It's not the worst case scenario. And, you know, although it's painful, and I think we've been making so much progress and so many things, I just don't think it's realistic that we're going to get to the end of our collective budget development and think that we're going to have a net add on the school side if the city is hemorrhaging positions like that. It doesn't have to be equal on both sides of the ledger, but I just don't think that that's a realistic outcome, and it behooves us to start at least talking at a high level about what it would look like to have a budget that, including the positions that are funded through the CARES Act, would keep total staffing levels at about where they are right now. The other point that I will make, just process-wise, that the superintendent alluded to is, or I guess this is kind of a question too, can someone just remind me of the actual statutory provisions or the reduction in force and when notice would have to be given? Javier, you're on mute.
I'll unmute him. I'll unmute him. Yep. I can't unmute him.
So it's 90 days from the time of notice.
Okay. So,
and can I just, Justin, can I just follow up on that? Is that 90 days upon notice of the elimination of the position or the actual person's job?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the distinction.
I think, or at least when I was cutting positions on the school board, we had to eliminate the position by vote, and then subsequent to that, we had to actually eliminate the person by name, their employment. And if that is the case, and if you know, I don't think we need to know tonight, but if you could just confirm that for us, just so we know if it's it's probably a week or two difference if it's one of the other.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Justin.
No, that's a good point. That's my recollection too. And well, I can't see Kate here right now, so I don't know, maybe she's remembering something, but yeah, that's my recollection as well. So, you know, I guess I just land at, we're going to have a big discussion to come, because obviously sort of the entire world has shifted under your feet during the process of developing this budget. And collectively, that's what we're going to have to wrap our heads around. 80% of the school's budget, you know, to use round numbers, is staffing costs. It's your salaries and your benefits. And there are statutory provisions tied to notice that has to be given to employees in the event of a reduction in force. And so I think we need to quickly just get on the same page about what that means in terms of a calendar, because I suspect that the discussions we're going to have are going to be of a pretty significant magnitude. And then we're going to have to figure out what level of cuts we can live with on each side of the ledger, if any. But we're going to have to figure that out. And realistically, at the orders of magnitude that we're looking at here, the only realistic way that you can do that is you're going to have to touch some positions. And so we need to know what the sort of the time frame for moving on all of that would be. And none of that is a criticism. I think I like so much of what is in the budget proposal. It's just we're obviously dealing with these incredibly unprecedented circumstances. But I think those are the things that we're going to have to deal with. You know, when we look at the magnitude of this, you know, I don't see a way that we avoid significant pain on one or more likely both sides of the municipal government unless there is aggressive federal intervention. That's really the only way that I see us getting out of this. And again, I just keep coming back to the high level that I asked Brendan to mock up is just giving the orders of magnitude, you know, and even the relatively easy to understand, I think, scenario where we're down $1.5 million a month in revenue creates a situation that is by a huge factor much worse than anything that we dealt with during even the worst times of the recession. So I'll stop there, but I think it would be helpful, you know, if we could probably just, to Nick's point, if we could get a quick memo just laying out the provisions around notice in the law so that we can start to have that difficult conversation sooner rather than later.
Thanks, Justin. Emily is up next. Can't hear you.
All right, there we go.
There you go.
Gotta love Zoom. I guess in thinking about where we're at right now, I believe Councillor Ray talked about this as a moment, where it's a moment in time, and it certainly is. I mean, we saw yesterday the Fed chair gave a dire warning that the US economy would be stuck in a painful multi-year recession if Congress did not authorize more aid to address the pandemic and the economic fallout. That was yesterday. The US House is poised to pass $1 trillion in funding for states and municipal governments. And so I really caution us to think about what the challenge that we're presented without acknowledging how the picture is evolving and changing, and what the future might look like for us. You know, what we've done in the past, frankly, in terms of our schools, has not worked for a lot of kids, for a broad swath of our population. We've left kids of color, students of color behind. We've left kids living in poverty behind. And as a district, we've just started implementing the Portland Promise and seeing that the huge achievement gaps that we have, 30 and 40 points in English language learning, in English language arts and math, we've started to see some small initial improvements in achievement among kids of color. And now is not the time when remote learning has exacerbated the opportunity gaps. I see it as a parent. I have a 3rd grader and a 7th grader. I have always worked remotely, and the amount of time that I'm spending every day helping, especially my younger daughter, both my kids are very driven to do their schoolwork, and I'm still spending countless hours a day working with my 3rd grader on her schoolwork. There are many kids in our district that face multiple hardships in trying to learn in this environment, and by all means, the remote learning absolutely exacerbates the challenges that we face as a district. And then just the idea that we're going to put together a 0% budget, that would be about a $3 million decrease cut in our budget, which would be dozens and dozens of teachers laid off and other staffing cuts. So I just encourage the council to think about the dynamic moment we're in, to think about the fact that our kids need to be able to have an education that enables them to address and overcome the challenges that they face living in our society, and then maybe lastly, so I'll leave it at that. But one last thing. So the superintendent, as you heard before he came to the finance committee, had a 0% tax increase in his budget. The reason why the finance committee moved to increase his budget was because that would have meant a loss of $650,000 at our highest poverty schools. Now is not, and that's because of the loss of federal title funding. And now is not the time to, I see at Reiki, the impact of that title funding is immeasurable. It fundamentally changes what Reiki is able to do. And the loss of those positions at this time, when the underlying disparities in our district are so heightened, would be a real travesty. So thank you for this conversation tonight, and I look forward to continuing to work with you to pass a budget that will enable all of our students to succeed.
Thanks, Emily. Councillor Chong has his hand up.
I just want to, I want to thank the school committee, and obviously, 6 out of the 9 city councilors were former school members, and so we have the kids' interest at heart, and all city councilors have the kids' equity and education in mind. And I appreciate what Emily spoke about, but the reality is this is not just a moment in time. This is kind of the new normal. When Oxford economists state that Maine is the most vulnerable economy in the entire country, it's not a moment in time. When we have 125,000 people who have filed for unemployment, and a big chunk of our economy, almost $9 billion, is our tourism, and Portland is heavily dependent on tourism, where we have over 600 eateries and we have dozens and dozens of hotels, and they basically lost an entire year, or they might lose an entire year of tourism. That's going to take many years for them to recover. So we have to be practical and realistic with what we have and budget for where we are. And the reality is, when only 85% of people actually paid their property taxes, when normally it's 99%, that means 14% of Portland's residents cannot afford to pay their property taxes at this time. Even with all the stimulus packages and unemployment and all those things that have come through our economy the last 2 months, 15% of our population cannot do that at this time. It's only going to get worse when those stimulus monies go away and the economy does not recover. And when you've got about 14% of the population that are elderly, who are on fixed income, and prices are going up, that's a concern for all of us. We look at everyone as equally important. Obviously, I've got 2 kids in the Portland school system, but everyone is equal in our eyes. So whether it's the elderly or whether it's someone who's living on a fixed income or barely getting by, we worry about them. And so we look at the collective. And so, the question I had was, what I heard from Superintendent Batana said was, he said it was the first time he heard the city's financial projections tonight. And I was just wondering if that's what I heard, And if it is true, then, is Miranda talking to Brendan about city's fiscal projections? Are they looped in? Because it would seem kind of unusual for me that this would be new information when, as a city councilor, that's not on the finance committee, and I see bits and pieces of revenue forecasts. I can connect the dots where we are economically. So I just wanted to give the superintendent a chance to let me know, like, whether this was the first time you heard the city's dire financial projections, or had you heard other bits and pieces of it, or if Miranda was able to talk to Brendan and get other bits and pieces of financial projections.
We've heard bits and pieces. For example, in the last meeting that we had with leadership, John mentioned the fact that revenue at the Jetport was down by 95%. We've talked in those conversations about the fact that the city is not collecting parking fees, that the city is allowing people to not use the purple garbage bags, and all of that is revenue. So, clearly, and we also read the paper, and we are, generally well-informed people. So, it's clear that the financial picture is bleak. My introductory comments spoke to the fact that there was a recognition, and there is a recognition that the financial picture is bleak in Portland, in all of Maine, and everywhere in the world. So, it was absolutely the first time that I saw what I saw today. So we did not have that before. And I would also say this is the first time that I ever heard anything in the neighborhood of 10% reductions, or scenarios where the city is losing $1.5 million a month, or $3 million a month, or $8 million a month. So that no question that we knew that the financial picture was going to be bleak, but what we heard today was different.
Okay, well, I would think that if someone knows that the airport enterprise revenues are down 98% and they bring in about $50 million of the city's overall revenues, you would think that it's going to have all these huge impacts on the rest of the city. And so that's why I'm trying to understand, if those are astronomical, off the charts, historic numbers, I'm still trying to understand a 2.5% increase when you've got these incredible dire numbers. So, I mean, if you heard it for the first time, that's fine. But I mean, I'm still kind of miffed at the 2.5% logic, given where we are historically. So, but I'm beating a dead horse. That's where it is. Thank you.
And Tay, we've frankly, the numbers we saw today, we just saw today. I mean, we've been talking about, frankly, some of us, encouraging the manager and the finance director to give us some order of magnitude. And frankly, I think there's been hesitancy because it's hard to do that at this point with any specificity.
Maybe just me, because I pre-calculated a lot of stuff in my head, and I kind of knew it was going to be really bad. So,
I think we all knew it was going to be bad. We were just trying to get a sense of how bad, and I do think we've had, as I said before, I think we have had good, productive conversations over the last few months, and this pandemic has definitely changed things. Let me check in on time. I've got a couple of people who haven't spoken, and then let's see, I've got one more, and then I want to get in. I just want to check in on time with folks. That it's at 8:30. Do people have another, 15 minutes for a few others to finish? Anybody who can't leave or has to leave? Great. Let's do that. Tay, you all set? Next, I've got Adam.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for the opportunity to have this conversation, and thanks everybody for the diligent work coming into tonight. Not an easy time by any means, and those that are in front of these spreadsheets trying to work the numbers, I give them tremendous credit for being thoughtful and transparent as possible to get us here. I'd just like to support what the superintendent just said. We just heard these numbers tonight, and the conversations have been extremely thoughtful to what the city is considering and facing. We're not oracles. We didn't know what we might hear for what the final numbers, or not even final, but the updated numbers will be. And that's why we had moved from, a budget that had upwards of a 3%, 4% tax increase when times are good, down to a 0% and now a 0.5% tax increase. So if that doesn't show that we were headed in the right direction, I don't know what more we could have done. And so I just don't think that's a conversation worth continuing. The 0.5% increase, tax increase that we have in here, it's a moral question, right? This is a time of sacrifice. No doubt about it. We're all dealing with it different ways. Some people don't have to sacrifice anything. They're doing quite well these days, and I'm not going to go down that road. My point is where the sacrifice lays, and who are we willing to sacrifice? Which kids? Your kids? Someone else's kids? It's something we have to deal with, right? And so the 0.5% that's currently there is a $15 on average household contribution to help us help the kids that are the most vulnerable right now. And we've had countless campaigns happening in this community about helping our neighbors, whether it's the Pay It Forward with the chamber, or restaurants offering meals to our frontline workers. Like, the goodwill is here, and it has to be backed by good fiscal thought. But I'm going to stand next to and in front of my kids and other people's kids all day long and say that I did everything I could. And I don't think that anybody here is saying they won't do that, but it's hard for me to hear the I'm socially liberal but fiscal conservative talk that's happening a lot, that these are our values, and but we probably can't fund them. I know it's not going to net out that way. It's my reaction right now, and so I want to own my reaction to that. But that is part of what's happening for me. I know that this group is going to do very diligent work to make sure that we're helping people in Portland. I know people on the council are going to do work to take care of people that are employed by you, and I know the school's going to do the same, and that we're going to stand by the kids. I'm just naming my reaction to something that's happening right now. I don't think that's the intent that's in people's hearts, and I hope it's not what ends up on the ledger at the end of the day. But I think we can figure this out. I think we can figure out how to help the kids that are hurting the most right now within what we understand. And I think we can figure out how to support them in the things that are about to come. We're already seeing the mental health crisis that's on the horizon due to what kids are facing right now. We already know how we're understaffed in the schools to support that in our public health infrastructure. We got a lot of things to figure out, and it's going to take reconfiguration of multiple things to shore up to make sure we can take care of our most vulnerable. And so I thank you in advance to you on the council for being in that work together. I'm not trying to point fingers. I'm not trying to say anybody's being duplicitous or anything like that. I'm just saying there's certain language that's happening that's a trigger for me, and to not say that would be not to speak my truth and to hold up a mirror to part of this conversation. So I look forward to having these conversations moving forward. Thank you all for your good, hard work here.
Thank you, Adam. I have Jill, Councilor Duson, followed by Councilors Costa and Ray, and unless another hand gets up, I'll jump in at the end there.
I'm struggling with avoiding having my triggers pulled with the tone towards I don't know, virtue ranking or something. I will instead focus on the notes that I made. I think that we have we came to this scenario tonight. This is a complete change in what we all expected. I think both sides of the ledger were prepared to be coming in with this astounding news of having zero or near zero budgets on budget increases or tax increases on both sides of the ledger, and that would have been a first time in quite a long time. That has changed. The scenarios have changed, and the news is very different tonight. So I agree. We don't need to spend a lot of time talking about who knew what news when, or how specifically folks were aware of the news. But the news is definitely different. And our responsibilities, therefore, are different. The context is completely different. We're responsible for building rational budgets based on the data in front of us tonight, knowing that that data may change tomorrow or next week. It's certainly going to change before we get through this, and that's what budgeting is about. When your numbers change, you change your budget. But for now, we have to do a responsible budget projecting based on what we know. My concerns so far are a couple. The budget cliff that's been discussed quite a bit, though I kind of am at the same place as Councilor Costa, that I think I can live with it, but it definitely concerns me, the custodial positions on the CARES Act dollars, because it very much reminds me of the struggle, multi-year struggle that we had on the city side, trying to move, I think it was police department positions, back into the budget after we funded them through the SAFER grant. So Nick could help clarify if that's if it was police department positions or fire department positions. It was fire, actually, but they were on a SAFER grant, a federal SAFER grant. We put those positions on that grant, and then we struggled for years to try to get them back into the budget. That worries me, as many have stated, but I have pretty good faith that we can figure it out. The subsidy, the other piece that is in my head is that it's the expectation that the city budget will backstop the school budget. That's part of the deal that we make. And that has happened cyclically over time when there's been a horrible set of circumstances that look like cuts on the school side. The city budget has generally backstopped the school budget. I think the difference in this scenario is that both sides are so horribly impacted. And so it's hard to see the backstop there because the city side has so much of cuts on city services side to handle. But what stays in front of me is that we're talking about the same families. We're not talking about, do you care about kids or not, or do you care about poor kids or kids who are challenged or not. We're talking about kids and their families, their parents, their grandparents, who are also trying to make it through this pandemic in our city. And that has to be, I think, the focus of our work to create a sustainable budget, or a budget that's going to get us through this hole. We have to be clear that we're responsible for addressing these issues for families in Portland. Some families who have kids in school and some families who don't, but all of those families, by and large, have children that they care about and children whose future they want to make sure are attended to. So it's not a competition between adults and children. For me, I'll listen more, and I'll certainly listen through the next meeting and work through rational position on these budgets. But for me, it would have been, I would have been happy to be at zero, even though I knew that took work on both sides. It's very difficult for me in the current scenario to look at these deep cuts on the city side and an increase on the school side. So that's kind of where I am. Thank you very much. I really appreciate all the work and heartache people have put into creating these budgets. And I hope we can be mutually respectful as we move through figuring out what our positions on them are. I'm done, Mr. Chair.
Nick?
Sorry, somehow I muted myself. Justin, you're up.
Thanks. So I'll just be very quick because I didn't want to leave this out there, and I want to be clear because of some of the other discussion, which I think was reasonable based on what people know. I don't want to put words in our staff's mouths, but I want to be clear that the bottom line numbers that we're looking at tonight and those various scenarios and stuff, those are coming from me. They're coming because I asked for them in the last couple of days based on the information that we were getting about the month of April as we're closing the books on that month in our finance department. So I want to be, again, I don't want to put words in Brendan's mouth, but I think he's being very clear that those are not in any way projections of what we expect to happen. And in fact, the reason we're not moving forward on the normal schedule is because the finance staff, the professional staff don't feel comfortable making projections. I wanted them out there so that people would be able to have concrete examples for the order of magnitude that we're potentially looking at. So I just want to be clear about that because I don't think there were projections to be shared. So if there was miscommunication, if it makes it look like the staff aren't talking to each other or something like that, I just want to completely own that. That's because of documents that I asked them to prepare. So I don't want to left that unsaid. And just to pick up very quickly, sort of my thoughts. I think the task before us right now is how to organize this in terms of contingency planning. I certainly hope that the federal government will act in some way and expect that they will act in some way, whether it's what we want or not is a different question. But what I do know is that the range of possibilities here is enormous. And we're not going to have a lot of time to solve this. So we need to be planning for all of the possible contingencies. And the last thing is just, again, I can't emphasize enough that we are all in this together. There's only one municipal government, and every one of us has an interest in all of the things that we're doing. And I mean that in a broader sense, but also in the particular sense, even if people aren't moved by that. I promise you, there's so many of us here that have, helped manage the school system over the years. The school department doesn't have an interest in having the Department of Parks and Recreation gutted and having those programs gutted because we have nowhere else to go. It doesn't have an interest in gutting homeless services or anything else like that. It certainly doesn't have an interest in us going after some of the city side funding that we're now putting into programs in partnership with adult ed. So collectively, we're all going to address this, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Councilor Ray.
Thank you. I was done, but I felt a need to speak again. I think Justin said that very well. I think Councilor Dusan spoke very well. I just want to kind of re-emphasize, this is about balance. This is not about putting weight on one particular area of the budget. In supporting schools, it doesn't mean you don't support police. In supporting the homeless, it doesn't mean you don't support recreation. We all need to make sure there's a balance across the entire city, because to have kids to support in the schools, there need to be families able to live in this city and able to get the services they need and able to pay their taxes. So we cannot say, I stand behind X and only X, because to do so means to get rid of everything else, and then we don't have a sustainable city. So I really hope we will avoid that language in the future. It is not helpful. It doesn't even make sense. It will be impossible to support increases and new investments while laying off huge amounts of city staff. Impossible. I don't think I was clear enough before. I'm going to be clear now. So I really felt like I had to say that again after some of the conversation that came up. Conversations have been really good to this point, and I hope they'll continue along those lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Kate?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to jump back in briefly. I really appreciated what Councilor Duson was saying. And I just want to put out there kind of for the record that when I suggest we talk about a 0% increase on the taxes and even a 0% increase on the budget, it's in the spirit of options and making sure that we have thorough conversations with the information that we have. And so none of this is easy. These are super stressful days. And I think everybody's reacting to things in different ways. And I also appreciate Justin's reference to these aren't hard projections. They're scenarios that were created, and sort of it's the environment that we're living in. And so I too want to just say, let's work together on this. We all want the best outcomes for our city, for the families who live in our city, for the kids who go to school here. And it's our job to make sure that we do that across the board in the city of Portland, whether it's police, fire, homeless services, schools. We are one city. So I guess I just want to say, in the spirit of working together, my request for considering options was really just that, so that we can do the best that we can in a really tight time frame. I mean, I have enormous respect for the superintendent's work and the staff's work on both the city and the school side in terms of responding to something so quickly. So that's it from me. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to go to Roberto next because he hasn't spoken, and then Tay will have something brief, I'm sure, and then I'm going to try to wrap up because we're a little past when we said we would. So, Roberto, where are you? There you are.
So I guess first of all, just want to thank everyone for sharing their thoughts. Usually when we have these joint meetings, the school department is sharing with the council information that we've already reviewed, of course, so hearing your input is incredibly helpful. So I'll be really brief. I just want to make sure that I'm gathering my notes and what you guys are saying accurately, because there's just want to acknowledge that there's a big gap between what would be a 0% tax increase and what it would look like if we did a 0% increase on the budget. That would be almost, I think, close to a $3 million gap. So if that's what some counselors are asking us to come up with, clearly it needs to be acknowledged that would be I don't know what that would look like. But clearly a 0% on the tax increase, I think we have a better idea what that would look like. So just want to make sure that we're clear on what you guys are requesting of us to consider as options, because that spectrum is quite broad or long between those two things that have been mentioned. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Roberto. And I think it's we've had a request to take a look at what a zero spending increase would be. I think I think it's reasonable to look at that, but personally, I would put that somewhat in the context of what Brendan has done with the city budget in terms of it could be a whole police department or something like that. I don't. Correct me, councilors, if I'm wrong, but I don't think the interest is to have you guys go back and come up with every position and program that would have to be cut to get to zero on spending. I think it would be a broad range if that's helpful at all. And councilors, give me a thumbs up or down if you think I'm way off. So I think it's a reasonable request to ask, but I think it should require a limited amount of effort in terms of saying, yes, it's so many positions or something to that effect. I don't know, Javier, you may jump in if you think it beyond that kind of broad brush, jump in.
Yeah, I think at that broad brush that is, I mean, I understood what Mayor Snyder said as, what would it look like at a 0% increase, and also at the 0% budget increase, not as a, I think in the spirit of options to look at, not in the spirit of I want this or I want that. So, but I do think, to Roberta's point, it's obviously very different. I think it's important for everybody to, and I think everybody on the dais knows that, but I want to make sure that everybody that is also listening or watching knows that those are two very different ranges. So
I think it's a fair number to look at. I think it's a really fair question to ask what it might entail. And I think it sounds like we're kind of on the same page that it would be a very broad brush option for more comparison purposes, I think.
Yeah, and just to contextualize a little bit further, that is in essence what would happen if we came forward with a budget and it was rejected, right? So that would be the reverting to the current year budget. What would that look like? So that's, I think that's a reasonable thing for us to actually think about and plan for. So.
Okay, thank you. Tay.
I'll be very quick or talk really fast. So I think what people need to understand is, having a 0% increase on the school side, but there's actual cuts on the city side, you can look at it two ways. You can say, oh, we don't support kids, or you can say, when you have to make cuts all across the board, but one department is coming at zero, you're actually making a bigger investment in that particular department than other places. So when we're seeing an $18 million budget shortfall as kind of the best case scenario, when we're asking the school to come in at 0%, whether it's 0% increase or 0% taxes, it's still a bigger investment in that department compared to every other department in the city of Portland. And we're talking about departments where they actually affect families, like all the other city councilors said. We have 125 families that are in hotels. We saw an increase of 54 overdoses, at the clinic. We're seeing police officers and firefighters having to put their, lives at risk to take care of families because we're seeing an increase in domestic violence and those kind of calls that they have to go and investigate on their own. So, when we see those cuts down, but we're telling one side to kind of come in at a regular level, you got to look at it as a positive investment. I mean, when it's a dire situation for everybody around, and that's the kind of proposal, and that's what we're asking of you to do, whether it's a $3 million possible scenario situation or a 0% tax increase, it's still a bigger investment compared to all the other investments. And that just shows you that we are committed to the future and kids. But, I hope we don't have to explain to you why it's important that all departments matter, because they all impact eventually they impact the kids in the school system because all those services are needed. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Tay. I am going to try to wrap up. And first, we've all been at this for 3.5 hours now. And I really appreciate that. I mean, it's a meaty topic, very important topic. kind of a early part, a general discussion of what we think is going on with the city budget, and certainly your proposed or soon to be proposed and voted on school budget. So I think by and large we've had a good conversation this evening. As I think maybe it was Tay who said it early. I mean, we do have 6 former school board members on the council. We get what your role is, and we get what our role is. And as some of you know, we've said this before, or I have said that, you entertain us asking a lot of probing, detailed questions about your budget, which really we have no control over those items. We only control the amount to be raised by taxes. So we appreciate, you allowing our indulgence to ask these questions every time we meet. And I think, as we all know, it helps us understand. This is a much different year, and we're dealing, well, everybody in the world is dealing with a lot of different issues that none of us have dealt with. So I think, I commend you for doing the work of the school staff and the school board to get to where you are. My sense as one counselor is, I don't think that we can have a tax increase this year. And I don't think the city is in any position to pick up an additional amount to balance that off. And not because we had projections, that were scary earlier in the meeting. I think even if we didn't have those projections, knowing what we generally know, it would, be very hard to ask for a tax increase. And I understand Anna and I have spoken. I understand how the finance committee had concerns about the title funding. I understand how you got there. I don't think it's an unreasonable place to try to get. I think for us, or at least for me, it's going to be what I think the community can support. And I know if that's the case, then you or the superintendent, and then ultimately you have to go back and figure out a way to get to a zero. As you heard tonight, there, and I could be persuaded to be below a zero in this case. Certainly, we've heard comments that I think that we should be below zero. I don't know if there's a majority of the council who's there or not. But I think looking at what the ramifications would be, again, not trying to figure out, this is going to be this position or that program, but what the range is, whether it's the zero spending, or if it's a 1% reduction, or is it a 2% reduction? What are those dollar figures? And so I think that's something we should talk about at our next meeting. But for me, I don't think the community can support a tax increase at all this year, given what's going on. So we will have to kind of figure out where we are in another week, but hopefully, and I appreciate, we have, I think, 8 counselors who've been on this at one point or another tonight. So it's been good to have the participation by the full council, and it will help as we get forward to a finance committee vote and ultimately a city council vote. So I think I'll leave it at that. I think you have the sense of where I am, and again, I do come back to, I think we've had some really good communication with the board leadership and the superintendent and finance director, and I really appreciate that over the last few months. So with that, I'm going to adjourn our workshop, our meeting, which is kind of a workshop, and thank everybody for hanging in there.